I'm working on this John Deere 110 garden tractor. This is part 16 of a multi-part series. In the last video, I cleaned out the fuel tank and got that installed. And then I started the engine for the first time since I've had it. But I don't like that knocking noise. That sounds like a rod knock. So I'm going to take it apart and see if I can fix it. First I'll drain the oil. That looks pretty dirty. It didn't look that bad when I looked at the dipstick. I'll have to remember that. I want to see the connecting rod, so I'm going to take the oil pan off. That all looks pretty normal in there. I want to measure the backlash when the rod is attached, but I can't get a good reading with the oil that's between the rod and the crankshaft. So first I'm going to take the rod cap off and see what it looks like. You only need to bend it far enough to get a socket on there. I'm going to use an extension so I don't get near that oil dipper. This rod cap only goes on one way. There's the little bump that goes towards the flywheel. And there's one on the rod that matches. That all looks pretty good so far. Everything looks flat and smooth. I'm going to wipe the oil off of these parts. The layer of oil takes up space, so you don't get a good reading unless it's all dry. Now I'm going to put it back together and see how much movement there is. Here's my setup to measure the movement. It's a magnetic base stuck to the side of the block and an indicator to show how much the crankshaft arm moves. Ideally, you want your indicator shaft perpendicular to the crankshaft throw. Now when I move the crankshaft back and forth without moving the piston, you can see how much clearance is between the crankshaft and connecting rod. First I'm going to rotate the crank hard enough to move the piston until the dial gets to 0. Now I'm going to move the crankshaft back and forth with very little force. The piston's not moving, and you can see the clearance is a little less than 4/1000ths of an inch. To check it in a different place, I'll rotate the crank and move the piston up to about the 14 mark, and it moves back to the 10, showing the travel is a little less than 4/1000ths of an inch. and I can move it back to where it was, wiggle it back and forth to get the same reading. So I'm claiming that's a good reading, a little less than 4/1000 of an inch. Now I want to know how much the crankshaft is out around. First I'll measure 90 degrees from the crank throw. That shows 1 inch and 184 thousandths. Measure it a couple of places to make sure they're the same. Now I'll measure in line with the crank throw. That shows 1 inch and 183 thousandths. Measure in a different place and make sure that's the same. Now I'll measure halfway between those two positions in both directions. Those readings are halfway between the others, so that all makes sense. This crankshaft is about 1/1000th out of round or egg shape. This is the specifications page from my old Kohler engine manual. This engine is a K181, so I'm looking at this column. Down here in the crankshaft area, it lists the crank pin specs. This is supposed to be 1 and 186 thousandths of an inch, but this crankshaft measured 1 inch and 183 or 184 thousandths, so that's 2 or 3 thousandths under spec. Next, the maximum out around is 1/2 thousandths, but this crankshaft is 1/1000ths out of round, so that's out of spec. The maximum taper is 1/1000ths. I didn't measure any taper, so that part is in spec. The other part of this spec sheet that matters is down here in the connecting rod section. It gives a big end maximum diameter, but I'd have to pull the piston and put the rod together to measure that, and I'm not going to do that. The next one is the rod to crank pin maximum clearance. It says 3 1/2 thousandths of an inch. That's the one that I care about at the moment. This is a worn out engine with the worn out crankshaft, but if I can reduce the rod to crank pin clearance, I can get rid of that rod knock. These other two items on the spec sheet are about the small end of the rod, so I don't care about those. And that's everything on here that might be useful. When I took the indicator readings to check for crank pin clearance, I tried to set up the engine so the rod was 90 degrees from the crankshaft throw. Then I checked the crankshaft movement in this direction. When I measured the crankshaft journal, it's out around by 1/1000ths of an inch, and it's larger in this direction where I took the measurement. That's good. If I make the cap fit good at a wider part of the egg shape, then it should still have clearance at the narrower part of the egg shape. Another way to look at it, since I measured 3 1/2 thousandths clearance in this direction, that means I should have 4 1/2 thousandths clearance in this other direction, because the crank pin is thinner that way. I need to reduce the clearance when this cap is bolted to the rod, So I'm going to take material off of this face. I'm going to use emery cloth to do it, and I'm going to keep it flat by doing it on this granite surface plate. I have some 320 grit emery paper. If I move this around on the emery paper, it would remove metal, but I couldn't hold it perfectly square by hand. I'd be putting too much pressure on one side or the other and end up with a curved surface. So I made up this contraption to help me hold the part. I made this back section with 2 legs. This front section is an indicator holder that you would use on your milling machine. If you loosen the knob, everything loosens up, and you can position it how you want it. Then you tighten the knob and it locks in place. Now I'll clamp this rod cap to the end of it. There's some ejector pin marks on this side, so I'll clamp it on the smooth side. To help me set it up, I'll use this steel block to hold up that midsection. Loosen up the arm, and I'll clamp the rod cap to this square end. Now with the knob loose, I can move this rod cap where I want it, and I'm going to put it in line with this center rod. Make sure the rod cap is firmly on the surface and tighten the knob. I'll remove this setup block and all that should stay rigid. This clamp handle is touching the surface plate. I'll put some masking tape on that to hold it out of the way. Now I should be able to move that around on the emery cloth, and this thing will help keep it flat on the surface. Okay, that's my plan for that. Now I need to know when I've taken enough material off. So I'm going to measure how deep this curved part is. This is a depth micrometer. The stem is tapered on the end to fit into small places. There's a flat on the tip, but it's not very big. So I'm going to measure how deep this cap is before I start. And that measures 580 thousandths of an inch. You have to make sure both of those legs stay on the surface plate. Now it measures 579.5 thousandths, so that only took off a half a thousandth. I still have a ways to go. I'm going to add some water. Now it measures about 579 thousandths, so I'm halfway there. I've been at it for a while, maybe a bit too long. I was shooting for 578 thousandths, and it measures about 2/10 of a thousandths less, about 577.8 thousandths. I'm going to stop there and give it the dial indicator check. I have the rod cap installed and tight, and this is my indicator set up. It looks like it's a little over 1 thousandths. I'll move to a different spot. It's about 1 thousandths there. Check it a few places. This test used to be showing about 3.5 thousandths. I took off a little over 2 thousandths, and now there's a little more than 1 thousandths. Remember, my crankshaft is egg-shaped by about 1 thousandths, and I was checking it at the wide part. Now I'm going to check it at the narrow part. The rod is in line with the crank throw, and I'm going to move the rod up and down. That looks like a little over 2 thousandths of an inch. So that looks good. The parts are still worn, so the variation is still there. But remember, my clearance was from 3.5 to 4.5 before, and now it's from just over 1 to just over 2. My bolts are tight but not torqued to spec yet. There's plenty of clearance here as I rotate the crankshaft. I can't rotate it all the way around yet, because this bending tab sticks out too far. And that contacts the camshaft if I rotate too far this way. I wiped all the oil off of the crankshaft and rod so I could get a good indicator reading. Now I'll take it apart for the last time to put some oil in it. I'll wipe away some of the excess oil where the rod bolts together. Make sure you line up the marks on the cap and rod. The torque spec on the rod bolts is 200 inch-pounds. That translates to 16 2/3 foot-pounds. On a wrench like this, where that doesn't move the needle very far, I'm shooting for 17 foot-pounds. And make sure the needle's on 0 when you start. I'll take them both to 10 pounds first, then 15 pounds, then 17 pounds. Now I need to hammer the lock plate against the nuts again. The original gasket's still stuck to the block pretty well, so I'm going to leave that there. Wipe off the excess oil with a paper towel, then put some gasket sealer on that. Okay, just like that, I have the engine back in the frame, and I need to add some new oil. That looks good. I'm still connecting the battery with vice grips until I get a few more runs on it. I'm going to turn on the gas. The gas in that sediment bowl looks pretty dark. It's only been in there a few weeks. Most of the gas drained out of the carburetor when I had it off of there. So I'm going to pressurize the tank. Look now, that gas is lighter color again. So I blew all that darker stuff into the carburetor. Okay, that sounds better. Now I hear the lifters ticking and some other stuff rattling. Sounds like the belt's flopping around some, but I don't hear a rod knock. I never did mess with this variable speed drive. It looks like it works, but it's out of adjustment because it don't travel very far. I'm going to drive it around for a bit. transmission don't feel right. Here I was trying to get the fourth gear, but got reverse instead. That combine makes more noise than this does. This is first gear, the creeper gear. Okay, that looks pretty good. The engine sounds about normal. There's a lot of rattling going on. The seat don't rattle. Most of that noise is probably the belt flopping around. Well, that worked out pretty well. Alright, that's it.